Hey there, everyone. It's Mike again, Mike Yao with Savage Kingdoms role-playing game and Fire in the Head Productions, my little production company, blah, blah, blah. So today I decided to do a video on the differences and similarities between Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition particularly and Savage Kingdoms 3rd edition particularly. It's a really long title. I'll probably actually shorten it, but anyway, that's what it's about. So I'll see if I can do this in 30 to 40 minutes because there's a lot to talk about. So, but a lot of us have spare time, so long videos are kind of in now. Yeah, so let's preface it by saying, start with Dungeons & Dragons. So Dungeons & Dragons has been around since 1974, technically in December of 1973, actually. But 1974 is when it's typically credited as sort of the larger first 1,000 sort of copies that went out. And I've been playing since 1979, so pretty long time. Gosh, 41 years, crazy. Created by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, and stuff you probably already know. But I just wanted to preface that out there for some of you, perhaps younger folks that don't really know how far back Dungeons & Dragons goes and how much it is in modern day society, particularly video games. So whenever you hear the term hit points or health or really any sort of thing related, or even just the term a role-playing game, even though a lot of computer games aren't really role-playing based in the sense of deeper role-playing and I guess acting. But I guess you are inhabiting a role, so in a sense that is actually correct. So originally in D&D, in fact, actually just the term role-playing really just kind of meant that you were playing a role as a thief or as a fighter or as a wizard, and the deeper connotations of sort of acting and character development were I mean, they were there, but they weren't really hit upon quite as deeply as nowadays, which is good. I actually, particularly speaking as an actor, I actually prefer the fact that it's deeper, and as a storyteller, it's role playing is really you would almost call it an acting experience, as it should be, to develop your character in the traditional sense of the word, not just the mechanical sense of the word. So Savage Kingdoms has only been around since 2014. That was when the original edition or first edition was published, and then the Reforged edition, which is kind of the second edition, but really 1.5 edition was 2.5, 3 years ago, and then now we're on the third edition. The Kickstarter is not doing that well, but because it's completely because of the crisis going on, so I totally get it. But even if it doesn't make, we'll find some way to get a book out there, or at least a PDF, because I already have it like 99.9% written and laid out and stuff. So, all right. So, what are the similarities and differences between Savage Kingdoms and Dungeons and Dragons? Let's start with the obvious. D&D and SK are both medieval fantasy, which would be called the medieval fantasy genre, a very popular genre of literature, as it should be, because it's awesome in general. Subgenre-wise, however, Dungeons & Dragons is more high fantasy, which is more Tolkien. It's even more higher fantasy than that, honestly. Tolkien, Lord of the Rings is kind of the hallmark of high fantasy, but I'm not a huge fan of high fantasy, but I love Lord of the Rings because it's more grounded. It's modern high fantasy is a little too whimsical and over the top for me, a little too cartoony. Lord of the Rings kind of grounds things a little bit, but it's still high fantasy because you're still dealing with elves and dwarves and hobbit, races beyond human that finally come together and overcome a dark lord, and everything is more black and white in high fantasy. Savage Kingdoms, on the other hand, the difference would be between Dungeons and Dragons, it's a little more sword and sorcery based. There's even elements of historical fantasy kind of thrown in there, and mythology, which D&D has as well. So, but yeah, it's a little more of a Dark Ages, somewhat grittier, grounded, and sword and sorcery themed game. So that is a little difference between D&D and Savage Kingdoms. Okay, so what's the next thing? Races. races, and cultures. So Dungeons and Dragons has the traditional, again, the game that kind of started the whole thing about you choose your race, and then that's how you build your character in role playing games. You generally start with your race because character creation, and this is the way I like to design games as well, or it should be organic, like it should be in general the order of way your life actually happens. So you're born into the world as a certain race, you make that choice. Generally, you choose your class next because that's probably although I guess in D&D background should be next because that's kind of what you started to become, and then in a sense of Dungeons and Dragons then you choose your class, and that's kind of your current profession or occupation, so to speak. So you have your traditional fighter and rogue and mage or wizard and priest as your four sort of, or cleric as your four sort of iconic roles, and then from there you have some sort of specialty roles such as ranger and paladin and monk and sorcerer and etc. Um, in Savage Kingdoms, the similarity is that you do choose a race and culture, just like most tabletop role playing games, particularly in fantasy. And however, the little difference is that it is a human based, human centric setting because that's how sword and sorcery genre typically is. But don't just when you choose human, that has no meaning. So there's a lot of rich cultures in the setting. So when you're saying I'm human, that's great. That's thank you. That's the 99% of the people you're talking to, NPCs you're talking to in the game. What's more important is your nationality or ethnicity. Where did you come from? Are you Malovian? Are you from Norland? Are you Norish? Are you Asmondian? Are you Larenthian? Are you Pridonian, Brithian, Eridornian, Garanik, whatever? That's far more important because that gives you game mechanically some a couple little racial abilities, some free specialties. You get favorite talents and stuff if you choose things that are more cultural appropriate that your culture embraces and kind of teaches each other. Um, so yeah, it's kind of a throwaway to say human. Well, in fact, it means nothing because you still have to choose what type of human you are, what type of culture you are in Savage Kingdoms. Uh, so SK does though have non-human options, just like D&D. They're rare. In fact, they're completely optional. The game master, if he's running more pure sword and sorcery themed game, or he wants even more historical fantasy kind of elements to it, then he or she doesn't have to allow the non-human races. But they're there. So you have the Shi, the three types of Shi, the dark Shi, the Aluna Shi, and the wild Shi. You have three types of Sleer, the serpent folk. They're a caste system. They're literally born with different colorations, which tells what they are. You have golden, red, and green, which is the noble caste, the hunter caste, and the warrior caste. The Chinari, there's two sub races or two types of Chinari. The Mezcan Chinaris, which are smaller, more leopard jaguar folk, and then you have the somewhat larger Imangian lion folk. What is the other option? Dwergar. So the Duergar are basically dwarves in other settings. People kind of call them that here too. They don't really like it. But they are the Duergar, which really just kind of means dwarf in their language. In fact, I think in Old Norse, that's actually what it means. Um, so enough about races and classes. Those are the similarities and differences between D&D and SK. Excuse me. Let's move next to classes, which I sort of touched on. Okay, so D&D, you choose a class. Like I said, fighter, rogue, ranger, paladin, whatever, cleric. So that's a big mechanical thing. That's probably the main thing. Class seems to make even more difference than race in D&D, which I always slightly disagreed with, but I totally get it. Gives you a package of abilities. That's basically what the definition of a class-based role-playing system is that you just choose a class and it gives you a package of stuff. It's really great for quick character creation. The limitations are that I see this with a lot of players, even like really young players. They want some more customization, and that's why I'm not a massive fan of class systems, but I do get it. I totally understand on a conceptual point of view why they exist, because it's just particularly in fantasy role playing. Um, and this goes way back to Tolkien and some of the early literature. It was pretty easy to define. That's the warrior, that's the assassin, that's the mage who travels with them, or the mysterious priest, or whatever. And that sort of carries over into gaming. So it's kind of easy to grab all of a concept that way. So in Savage Kingdoms, we have callings. Callings are similar to classes, but not exactly, not nearly as restrictive. They do give you some options and some mechanical benefits if you choose one. There are 20 options in Savage Kingdoms, running from assassin to berserker to craftsman to knight and merchant and sorcerer and seer and healer and priest and shaman, etc. Um, Gladiator, etc. So when you choose one, you get a package of favored talents, just like your race or culture, which means you pay 1 point less for the talent. There's even favored weaknesses, because certain callings sort of sometimes lend themselves to certain weaknesses that they might have, like assassins might be obsessed with killing or whatever, or um, knights might be more obsessed with honor or something like that. So, and then you start with some gear, some basic gear, and then some extra coinage. So you callings are optional. Actually, you don't have to choose one if you don't want to, which is really cool. That's a callback to the original system, where we didn't really have. We had something called life paths, but they were all suggestive. Like, okay, I want to build a berserker. This is the things I might want to look at, talent wise and skill wise and equipment wise or whatever. So callings just kind of brings that into a slightly more mechanical sense. But again, you don't have to choose one. The disadvantage to not choosing one is that maybe you might be a little lost conceptually. Your character might be a little muddled. But if you're good at creating a jack of all trades kind of character, that might work for you. Mechanically, the benefit would you get to start with some more coin, but you don't get the sort of the free base equipment. So it's sort of a trade-off there. So okay, next would be. What would be the next step? I'll touch on this really briefly, because it's a bone of a contention with a lot of people about alignment, or alignment-ish type thing in the game. So Dungeons and Dragons, or D&D, has alignment, which I'm not a huge fan of. When I was much younger and started playing, I thought it was kind of cool. But as you get older and start kind of looking deeper into characters and motivations and how real people operate, alignment's very limiting. However, as a game master, or as a dungeon master in D&D, I found it actually more beneficial, especially when creating like a character, an NPC on the fly, or a minor NPC. You don't have time to develop that much. It's easy to just kind of go, oh, this guy's neutral good, or this guy's chaotic neutral, or this person's lawful evil, or whatever. Um, so you have that in D&D, but a lot of games typically sort of ignore they kind of use it as sort of a background thing, which I think is sort of fine. In Savage Kingdoms, we do not have alignments, thankfully, on purpose, but we do have Code of Honor, which kind of helps. So every race or culture has a Code of Honor. If you look at the description of the racing culture, the write-up, the stats, I think it's towards the bottom. That's kind of the typically way they act, or they in society. What's important to them, how they tend to make moral and ethical judgments, or lack thereof. So it goes way back to in earlier times with mankind, when we lived more in tribes and small nations and clans. It's called tribal morality, is a kind of a term that's sort of thrown around, where it's your morality, your almost, which is tied often to religious beliefs, not to offend the gods and that sort of thing, are heavily tied to your tribe. So uh, protect, not stealing from each other, not killing each other is like an obvious thing, because you need people in your tribe to get through the winter and to survive being attacked or whatever. But when you met another race or tribe or clan of people, that morality didn't necessarily apply quite as much to them. And we still kind of see that nowadays too. And we sort of try to hide behind it, but it's there, sadly. But it is part of our DNA. And, unfortunately, it's like to see someone who looks different, there's an automatic deep-seated response in humans to sort of react a little on edge. Fortunately, in modern society, we've learned to get over a lot of that. Again, some of it still exists, but we've learned to sort of push beyond that. But Just a quick side note: there's a reason that sort of exists because it goes way back to tribal times. So yeah, you have a code of honor. You don't have to follow it. It's just suggestive how that type of race or culture typically acts, and they're kind of cool to read through. There's like 6, 7 bullet points in each one, so they're kind of fun to roll, and it gives you something to go off of. Because again, some people are like, well, I need something to kind of play off of. So here you go. An elite order too. If you join an elite affiliation, such as a priesthood or even the Shadow Hand, an underground organization, or a knighthood. So they all have codes of honors too, or sometimes called tenets. A code or tenets that you have to follow. Those tend to be a little more stricter, particularly if you're in like a secret society and you don't follow the rules. You can be ousted, you can be exiled, excommunicated, possibly even executed. So, yeah, that could be a little stricter. Those. Okay, so moving on to the next point of similarity slash differences. I would say, I don't know why I'm doing this. Uh, I would say, let's see, we did alignments, we did, okay, feats. So in Dungeons and Dragons, these are optional in 5th edition, apparently. Feats are a thing that you, every 4 levels, I think in general, you can make a choice to an ability score boost, or you can choose a feat. So feats are kind of things that are outside of your class, or like special knacks or cool little thing that you can do. And in Savage Kingdoms, we have talents, which are similar, but they are even bigger and more important because they're actually a major part of the game. They're not optional at all. You really kind of need them. And the reason why is because talents in Savage Kingdoms represent, there's 6 categories of them. So overall, they represent feats in Dungeons and Dragons as well as class features. So that's why they're super important. Since it's not a class-based system, you can actually choose different talents. Your calling might lean you towards a certain way, and even your race, but you can still make complete different choices if you want to. So that's why talents are very important. They kind of represent class features and feats in a D&D sense. So that's a similarity, but they're different enough. And then you get talent points to spend and all that stuff, but that's from the character creation video. I don't want to get into that, but that's just the general differences and similarities between the two. Going back really quick, I forgot something sort of major. Another similarity between Dungeons & Dragons and Savage Kingdoms would be ability scores and attributes. So D&D has what's called ability scores. Those are your strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, charisma. There's 6 of them. They kind of define the main sort of pillars of your character, um, physically and mentally. And Savage Kingdoms, we have attributes, which are really kind of the same thing. And in fact, there's 6 of them: agility, physique, vigor, intellect, magnetism, and willpower. Those are kind of a main pillar as well. So yeah, I just wanted to go back on that real quick. So then I was talents, weaknesses, and that's strictly a Savage Kingdoms term. So in Savage Kingdoms, we have something called weaknesses, which are kind of cool for character building, because they can happen after character creation. If you earn a weakness in game, you don't get bonus points for it. So weaknesses are allow you to at character creation. You can choose 1 or 2. Sometimes some people can start up to 3. It's a total of 5 bonus points worth, and they give you bonus points to add towards your talents and/or your skills. Your skill points when creating character. Like I said, if you earn a weakness in game, say you got a couple of fingers chopped off, you get the maimed weakness. You don't get bonus point. You don't suddenly get, oh, I'm smarter and I get more talents and skills because of it. The reason you get it at character creation is because it gives you a mechanical benefit to choose a weakness other than the cool role playing possibilities, but also it kind of represents the fact that if you've probably had that weakness for a while and you have actually learned to overcome things and compensate a little bit, and that represents the bonus points for talents or skills. So a nice little side note there. So D&D doesn't have weaknesses, at least not called that. They do have, it's not very hard mechanical, but they do have flaws. So if you look at your personality traits, I think it's in the upper right of the I guess, standard character sheet. So flaws is one of the four sort of categories there. So it's more of a strictly role-playing thing. I guess the only mechanical benefit is that theoretically, if you role-play those traits really well, the GM is supposed to give you inspiration on occasion. So that's the only sort of mechanical benefit. But again, they're cool to have for role-playing. A flawed hero is a real hero. If you read any literature about heroes, or even historically, there's 0% chance that person is not flawed. They're going to have a couple of flaws or two. It makes them much more interesting because it makes them much more human, or human-esque. So the next thing I would say to talk about would be, let's say, combat. Fairly major pillar in most role-playing games. It's one of the three pillars, as Savage Kingdoms, or no, as Dungeons and Dragons calls it, combat, social interactions, and exploration, I believe. So Savage Kingdoms, I don't really pop out specifically those three pillars, but it's pretty clear that it's one of the things, along with exploration and social interaction and a bunch of other little subcategories you could probably throw in there. So combat is in D&D and Savage Kingdoms. It starts kind of the same. It uses a similar initiative system. It also uses 6-second rounds. Originally, Savage Kingdoms was 5-second rounds, and so there were 12 rounds in a minute. I guess I was just trying to be different, and then originally I just there's no copyright on 6-second rounds, so let's just do that, and that way there's 10 rounds in a minute, so it makes it a little bit easier mathematically. Also with the action system, which I'll get to in a second. But basically, so you roll a d20, you add your initiative modifier. Dungeons and Dragons is based on your dexterity modifier, and Savage Kingdoms is based on your agility plus your willpower. It actually is its own stat-derived trait called initiative. So, and the reason I do agility and willpower is because to me it represents not only your physical quickness, like in D&D, dexterity, but it also represents your state of mind, your mental quickness, your mental awareness. Somebody with good willpower is going to be a little more steady in the moment, not panic, and they can react faster. So that's how initiative works, and also it goes from the highest to the lowest. And it's cyclative. D&D and SK are both cyclative initiatives. However, in SK and Savage Kingdoms, there is an optional sidebar for re-rolling initiative every round, which is really cool. It makes combat really chaotic and unpredictable. It's really awesome. I highly recommend it, except for the fact that it does slow things down, and I'm not personally a big fan of slowing combat. I like combat to be visceral. I like people to make choices, and if they make a wrong choice, it represents the fact that if you're really in a battle and there were several, you're just going to react on what you know, what your training is, and you may not always make the perfect tactical decision as a player sitting in front of a character sheet might, given a minute or two. But if you don't mind it being, it doesn't slow. If you know how to record initiative like really swiftly, it's not that big a deal. But you do have to re-roll every round. The payoff is really cool though, because people can't metagame and go, oh, this person's actions are next, his turn is next. It's like, nope, new round. It might be the person that went last in the first round might suddenly go first, and also keeps people more focused on the game and aware, instead of like, oh, my turn isn't 3 players away, I'll go wander off. So that's also cool for player engagement and game master engagement. So there is an option for re-rolling initiative at the top of every round. Speaking of which, so otherwise combat is fairly similar the way it's broken down, but I'll hit on some key differences which I think are kind of cool. So in D&D you have an action. Every round you have an action, which is kind of your main thing that you do, and then you have a move if you want to, and I think it says there's a free item manipulation action, like a minor thing, like you pull something out of a belt pouch or something like that. Or I was going to say light a torch. I think lighting a torch is a full action, which would make sense. It takes actually a little bit of effort, in a few seconds at least. So in Savage Kingdoms, you have 2 actions, and each action takes roughly about 3 seconds because there are 6 seconds in a round. So you literally just have 2 actions. So it's very simple. The caveat is that you only get 1 attack action per round, and that's to keep people from doing something like moving up an opponent, and then now they spend pretty much the rest of the combat just slugging out 2 actions, just standing toe to toe. It's very boring. So allowing only the one attack action actually creates more creativity, and people have to think a little bit more. So usually the standard thing is that, and it's kind of like in D&D, it's like one action would be to move up and engage in melee. So a melee attack would be your second, or you stay back and launch a ranged attack, and then maybe you move into a different position into cover or something as your second action. Um, and by the way, there are ways to make multiple attacks as the same action in Savage Kingdoms. So there are talents such as ambidexterity. You can, if you're armed with two light weapons, you can actually make two attacks. With your offhand is a -2 penalty. Shield bash is another one. If you are bearing a shield, you can. If you I think it costs a stamina point or two to do it. You can use the shield to bash. It doesn't take away from your protection rating, your armor that round either. It's assumed that you're, as a real good shield wielder would in combat, that you know how to block and strike at the same time. Um, so that allows you a secondary attack. Pugilistic follow-up is really cool. You can actually follow up with a brawling attack, such as a punch or kick or knee or headbutt, to the same target after you stab with a spear or slash with a sword or whatever it is you're attacking with melee weapon-wise. So that's a way to get multiple attacks. And then there's certain races, non-human races, such as the Sleer that have a bite attack, or at least the red Sleer do. And the Chernare have a claw attack. So you could do a weapon strike, claw attack as your secondary, which is -2. And you can even stack it if a Chernare or Sleer has possesses the pugilistic follow-up talent, we'll say. So they could do a weapon strike, claw or bite attack, followed up by another brawling attack, such as a knee kick or whatever. And that would be also at a -2. So, but anyway, there's three attacks right there, all as one action. And so your action can also be spent. There's a couple of talents that run off. For example, a good battle muse. I've seen people do. It costs a stamina point, but if you use Battle Muse to inspire, to drum and inspiring words in battle, that's one action, and then you still have another action to actually attack yourself or move, not attack yourself, but attack an opponent preferably, and or move. So you can only cast one. Also, another caveat: you can only cast one spell in a round, so you can only use one action to cast a spell. Savage Kingdoms typically is ritual-based magic, at least NPCs, which takes an hour. But a lot of player characters use sort of combat magic, or what's known as spontaneous magic, which means you're doing it in 2 or 3 seconds, which takes a lot of energy. That's why it costs stamina. Even if the spell doesn't work or manifest correctly, that's why you still spend the full stamina, because you're still channeling that power through you. It's just if the spell fails, it doesn't actually ever really fail. Just it doesn't manifest correctly into the way that you want it to, into the actual spell result. So nice little side note there. So you couldn't try a second spell, even if it failed as a second action, because it's just too much power, too much energy. You're kind of staggered for a moment, and you would have to do something else. So yeah, I think that sort of covers that more or less. Combat and actions, or combat-esque actions. Anytime an initiative is rolled, that's how that works. Similarities and differences. So next, let's move to magic or spells, more specifically, spell casting. So the similarities are both systems obviously have magic. There's a shock out right there. The base, but since they're fantasy, so magic and sorcery are kind of a big thing. In Savage Kingdoms, it's often called sorcery because it has a darker connotation. Magic is a little more suspicious unless you're a member of a tradition or order that your culture is used to. It's like, oh, that. In other words, that you're trusting that person to use magic appropriately because that's what they're trained to do. But you see someone wandering into your realm from another culture and they're doing some weird stuff, and that's when it gets very suspicious, and that's when it might be called more like sorcery instead of just magic, even though they're both really the same, but there's sort of different flavors and connotations involved. Um, so yeah, so game mechanically speaking, in D&D you have spell slots. Um, Now, slots kind of govern how often you can cast a spell. You do have at will magic, which are cantrips. Um, I'm personally not a huge fan of them, but they are what they are. Um, so spell slots again, sort of, I guess, kind of represent. I don't like the terminology that much. It sounds very game mechanically. It's hard to in game go. I'm sorry, my lords, but I am out of spell slots. I know not what to. It's like, what are you talking about? So role playing wise, I should probably say like I'm out of energy, or I can't prepare another spell today. It's just too much. Um, so that's the so in Savage Kingdoms, the similarity, the governing aspect or the fuel for magic is stamina. So how much stamina you have is how much spell energy you have. Remember, stamina also goes to other things too, like certain combat maneuvers. There's even some racial abilities powered by stamina. So it is pretty much an all governing statistic, and that's what I wanted. That's why I designed it that way. Which also really takes care of cool things like I want to build a battle mage. Uh, the best of both sort of main worlds. And it's like, well, that's great, but your combat maneuvers and your spells are going to cost you stamina. So you might want to make sure you have a pretty good willpower and a pretty good vigor to handle all of that. So it's possible, but there you go. You already have the built-in caveats right there. So yeah, so for example, in the Savage Kingdom, say you have 13 stamina points, you cast a spell, it costs 2, whether it worked or not, it still costs you 2 stamina, and so now you're down to 11. You could the next round, you could literally cast the same spell because as long as you know the spell, you can cast it. There's no preparation. The only sort of preparation stuff in Savage Kingdoms is if you're casting a ritual. That takes an hour. So that represents sort of preparing and setting up the spell and also the actual performing of the spell itself, the chanting and the perhaps dance movements and the precise movements that go with it, and the precise spoken words, manipulating some of the ritual components, perhaps. It's left very open. Players, if they want to, they can completely describe, um, hopefully not in super detail, but like what their ritual is involving. So yeah, so as long as you have the stamina, once you get to half stamina, you're fatigued, so you suffer some penalties there. Once you go to 0, you're at -5 all your stuff. You're barely conscious. So that's the governing feature for SK Magic is stamina, whereas in D&D it's spell slots. So similar but different. Okay, so I think that's about it. No, let's see, one last thing. Equipment or gear. So in both games, and pretty much in all tabletop role-playing games, almost no matter what genre, equipment or gear is a big deal, as it should be, as it is in real life. You need tools to ply your trade, and so that's what equipment is. So in D&D, you get some basic select gear, I believe you can choose from, and then you have some extra coins from your background choice, I believe, and to either just use as starting money or to buy some extra stuff. Very similar to Savage Kingdoms. The Savage Kingdoms, you get gear from your calling. You get some free things that kind of come along with it, tools of the trade, as it were, and then you get some extra coinage to buy extra things, or preferably to buy extra things, or you can just keep it in your pocket. But you should probably buy a few extra things because usually the basic package of the calling doesn't really cover quite everything. But a lot of it. If you don't choose a calling, like I said earlier, you get extra coinage to buy really more of what you want, but you don't get like some of the cooler basic things. Um, so it's kind of a trade-off there. Um, yeah, so an equipment includes SK. I get a little more detailed with equipment. I find clothing items to be kind of interesting. I know some people find it boring, but I sort of want to know what you're wearing and how many layers and what color. I think it's interesting. I see the character that way. A lot of times when people describe the character, they just kind of describe their face, and then you're like, well, what are you wearing? What are you carrying? What is it? Does it look worn? Does it look cool? Is it muddy? I mean, that tells me a story right there about where your character's been, or maybe if the character's highborn or lowborn or in between, etc. Sort of like that, or what culture you're from. That person's wearing a veil. That's kind of cool. Where I'm from, we don't really do that. Or that person's wearing a kilt or whatever. So yeah, equipment. So those are the similarities of it, equipment. As you start with it, the differences are the little things I kind of suggested. Oh, by the way, speaking of equipment and purchasing, D&D is a gold-based system. It always has been gold-based. It's a little, in my opinion, it's a little ridiculous if you really do the science on it, but it is fantasy. It works. It's easy. SK is a silver-based economy, and the reason I chose that is because it's a little more historical. It's a little more, I guess, quote unrealistic unquote, and it also does another cool thing. It allows gold to be more of a big deal when you actually do find a gold piece or two or something gold plated or solid gold. It's like, so that's kind of a big thing. It's like a little bit of a thrill, and it also makes the lower denominations of coinage such as bronze or copper pieces actually mean something as well, at least when you first start off. So yeah, I think that's I think that's it. I think I covered most everything. I'm sure I missed a few little things. But anyway, those are the general similarities and differences between Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition and Savage Kingdoms 3rd edition. Because people have asked some things, and there's a few things too I thought I would bring out. Um, and just in closing, I think this is a cool closing thing. Some philosophical differences I think that might be interesting. I've noticed, particular. So most people start with Dungeons and Dragons. That's the gateway drug, as we say, which I did, and a lot of people did. And so if you play that a lot, and that's great. It's great. Obviously, it's fun. And it's but there's some different philosophical. So I've noticed some people play. They've only played D&D, and then they suddenly come into Savage Kingdoms. They think it's going to be almost the same. It's like, in some ways, it is because it's medieval fantasy, but there are some subtle differences, like I mentioned earlier in this video and other videos. But there's also some little thing, like in combat, you have to be a little more careful in Savage Kingdoms and a little more respectful of your enemies because you do have, in general, less health. Now, armor is better in Savage Kingdoms, but you still have to be really careful, especially if somebody explodes a 20 on an attack roll and suddenly they're doing maximum damage. And if that maximum damage is from a battle axe or a maul or something, or a great axe, you're looking at potentially 30 points of damage, which the majority of characters can't handle. In fact, that instantly kills a lot of characters. So you have to keep that in mind. You have to be a little more respectful, particularly in combat in Savage Kingdoms. And also towards magic and the philosophy towards magic, you just embrace the fact that it's a little more mystical. And Savage Kingdom is not quite as common, or at least in the open, and it can be a little suspicious, which is why it's sometimes kind of called sorcery, which is typically, and sword and sorcery is typically a somewhat more darker or a negative connotation. So yeah, so I just want to end on some. So there's definitely a little bit of philosophical and role playing approach differences as well. So anyway, hopefully you guys enjoyed this. Thanks for watching it, and if you didn't make it all the way through, well, you don't see what I'm saying anyway. So but thanks for giving it the old college try. So in the meantime, you guys take care and stay safe and stay sane.